This is Duke University.
I do race and gender studies and cultural studies with an emphasis on bioethics and literature and law. What I'd like to do is give 5 frames for questions that come from the presentations of my colleagues and also ways of focusing us in on some of the issues that have emerged here. I'm one of those black Twitterati, and I think it was a tweet to my colleagues or an email, I don't know the difference these days, saying that I was Twitter exhausted. I think that I had tweeted more about Ferguson than any other event since I joined Twitter, and I think at the moment of the Troy Davis execution. And the result of that academic exhaustion is to invite us here to have a conversation together. So I'd like to thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to the conversation that we'll engage. The first area I'd like to speak of is how to negotiate the social media narrative that has emerged around the killing in St. Louis, in Ferguson. This is a space, social media, that both urges our participation with a particular kind of response, with a hashtag. The hands up, don't shoot in particular got to me because halfway through that, and probably earlier than that, I realized it was a motion, a pose that I would never participate in. And I became more critical of even my retweets of colleges and university students who had been participating, including Duke, and this is Virginia Commonwealth University. These are students at Howard University, all participating in this moment because of the immediacy that hashtag activism urges. It also doesn't always give us the time to reflect at what I call now a pose of participatory objection, one that allows us to strike a familiarly vulnerable pose that is not challenging and that at the same time embodies our vulnerability. And I have rethought publicly on Twitter and would rethink with you today about what it means to participate in a pose that you hope never to do for real. The second comment is, or the second area is the law and policing, and I really appreciate the way my colleagues, especially Monima, reminding us that this is the way the state, the carceral politics of the state are the way the state renews itself, invests itself in a certain kind of body, and almost has to, in order to make the state viable, have a certain policing of black bodies that results in fines, and if not fines, incarceration. Incarceration has moved, frankly, out of the state sphere and into the private sphere. There are private corporations that run prisons. But also to remind you about a prosecutor being an elected position, the opportunity the prosecutor in Louisiana, in St. Louis had to do what would have been a preliminary investigation with a grand jury, which would have resulted likely in the way that prosecutors who go before grand juries, and you've heard the phrase, a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich, and this is because the prosecutor's sort of aggressiveness there is no speaking that happens from the defense. The prosecutor decided not to go that route and decided to use an already seated grand jury, which stretches out the process. And we can look at that very critically and should look at it critically in terms of the options had and the one that will slow everything down, including long enough for enough witness narratives to come out, enough evidence to leak out so that when we finally do get a statement from Darren Wilson, wherever that might be and wherever he might be, that narrative has the opportunity to have heard all of the evidence that might be weighed against him later on. So the way in which this is happening is certainly questionable, but it is procedural as well. So it's an opportunity to think about the ways in which process happens and also with the way in which process happens, which is not going to be helpful to the bodies in this case. I've also been reminded in thinking about both the separation and the participation of police powers as well as legal authorities, statutory authorities, which are both different and involved with each other, the way we've been taught to think in this generation of thanking people that we see in military uniforms, the thank you for your service narrative that seems so familiar now, and no one I have talked to ever thinks about translating that to a policeman. And this is because I would argue the police cultivate a different kind of fear and terror and are not encouraged to win the hearts and minds of people the way we encourage our soldiers to win them overseas. And so there's a distinction in that which I think is worth thinking about. The third area is respectability politics. We've heard so much about dress. And so much, the town hall that Professor Neal participated in had a young man come up on stage in sagging pants. And I was following it on Twitter, and everyone was all a Twitter about what he was wearing, but what he was doing was showing the bullet hole in his body. And it was as if his clothing or his sagging clothing deflected attention away from the harm that had come to his body. And there's a slide that I've been kind of scrolling through that shows an image of protesters during the 1960s where they are we were taught, I was there, we were taught to be well-dressed. I was telling someone I remember buttoning my gloves to go to a protest, being told to wear stockings and short heels so the walk would not be, some of us remember that, so that the walk would not be so onerous, but certainly not anything like sneakers, and certainly not anything like the dress today. But just think about the way in which respectability politics and clothing and how we look is involved in this, which brings me to my last point. I'm going to skip over because Wanima did so well the urbanization of the militarization, the hyper-militarization of urban policing. But I want to get to public iconographies that involve children, and this is what prompted my last week's editorial on Shield the Children and how hurt I was and how cautionary I think we ought to be about involving children in demonstrations like this. And I told the story, which actually came from a book I wrote some 25 years ago, about dressing my children to go to church to honor or acknowledge or remember the children who were being killed in Atlanta during the time. Some of you remember hearing about the Atlanta child murders. And in that piece, I wrote about putting black armbands around my children, and my daughter thought it was a fashion statement, that it matched her black patent leather shoes. And my son said, "Are the kidnappers going to come get me next?" And it was at that moment I realized that the way in which an adult will process these, the way in which we have since the 60s used our children to push a particular kind of narrative, because if you see a child doing this, if you see a child holding her hands up, if you see a baby with a bottle saying, "Don't shoot," then it provokes a different kind of response. But I would also say that what we know about developmental psychology suggests that all our children don't have the kind of resilience to handle that kind of utility. So I want us to think about how do we look. The spectacle that Professor Lubiano spoke of, the spectacularity of the black body in sagging pants or with hands up, or the one that has stayed with me, the red dress that Mrs. Brown wore to her son's funeral. I don't know how many of you saw that image, but it was a striking image, because if we talk about black respectability politics, you don't wear red to a funeral. She wore a bloody red dress. My word is bloody. And I don't know what it meant for her, but it reminded me of what she had lost. And it was an in-your-face, well, how do I look moment. Certainly this was a grieving mother, and we are incorporating a whole body of grieving women into a national narrative, sometimes now with forgetting which bodies they stand for. So in the course I'm teaching now, which is Memorial Mania, I'm wondering today where the mania lies, and the course is designed around how the street corner memorials and how the public memorials of 9/11 and how the memorials we do in casual or informal situations, I don't even know how to use that around the language of memorial, turn into public art. But these memorials, in these memorials, we breach somebody's privacy. And I want us to think very carefully about how our looking at how we look at the body that lay in the street for 4.5 hours. There is no metric of ethical, moral, medical, legal necessity that left that child's body in the street. But what made it doable, what made it possible, was some kind of particular attention to the negligence around the Black body, the lack of privacy, and the ways in which they can stand in for what we need them to say. Thank you.
Produced by Duke University, online at duke.edu.